So ready?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just put a dictaphone on. So. Okay, so basically it would be almost like the same that we already spoken before, but maybe a bit more specific in terms of questions. So.
Yeah.
And the thing that I didn't see maybe in the presentation, and I would like to mention now, is like what is heritage? What is your definition? Yeah, what is heritage? Let's try this. What is heritage, and what is architectural heritage?
Okay.
In your maybe.
In my opinion.
Yeah, in your opinion.
So, heritage is more than just historic buildings, of course, because they are also landscapes, cultures, people and communities. And so I think that's the way in which you can make a distinction between architectural heritage, which is about buildings and about structures and about monuments. But obviously heritage itself goes a lot deeper and becomes a lot more about people, I think. And my specialism is obviously architectural heritage. Heritage itself is a wider subject, has a wider audience and a wider connection, I think.
Yeah. Okay. But why do you think it's important to preserve heritage? Because like you work in the field of preservation and consultancy in the preservation industry. And from your professional and maybe your personal perspective, why do you think it's crucial to work with this issue? Why it is important for city?
Yeah. Well, there are clear benefits to doing this. If we take it to, if we look at it from a personal view, it's a passion. You know, as a child, I was obsessed with First World War, the Second World War, history. I did history at school, I did it at university. I've done 2 master's degrees in heritage, and now I teach it. So, that for me personally is a passion. But as the wider benefits are, you can break them down and develop a criteria. There are social benefits, there are economic benefits, and there are community benefits. So they're all tangible. And if we look at them individually, social benefits are the sense of well-being. So if we preserve a place and we look after it so that future generations can enjoy and experience historic environments, that contributes to our sense of well-being. There are ways in which we can measure those parameters, and that links clearly to the economic benefits. As I discussed with you about restoring historic buildings, there's a demand for these buildings. There's a demand for the occupation of a historic building instead of perhaps a new building. There are listed buildings, for example, are some of the highest value buildings in a country because they are the most important. Historic materials are incredibly expensive now. It's very difficult to restore historic buildings with the right materials because of the cost of them. And modern materials are a poor substitute.
Okay, so how long have you been in Almaty so far? Like, what do you
6 days.
6 days.
Yeah.
And what is your first impression of Almaty architecture as you saw it and as you walked around the city? What did you think as it's your first visit?
Yeah, well, I think it was slightly prejudiced by the fact that I'd already read my chapter on Almaty in Owen Hatherley's Adventures in Post-Soviet Space, which, it's not yet published. That will be published in October of this year. But he'd been kind enough to send me that chapter. And one thing really stood out for me that he said in that chapter, which was, it's the greenest city he's ever been to. and Owen Hatherley, I really respect and value his opinions and views. Because I've read his books, and he's been in many places. He's travelled all over the world, and so if he wants to put his neck on the line, so to say, and go out there and say it's the greenest city he's ever been, I wanted to understand that, and that was my impression too. And he also described it as a modernist garden city. Well, a garden city in England is a very different concept. Garden cities in England were developed at the beginning of the 20th century and the end of the 19th century as a way of as a way of reacting to the industrialized, very polluted, very overdeveloped, very dense cities that had come out of the the Victorian industrialization process. So they started to create these kind of detached suburbs or even entire towns, which were based on very considered principles of urban design and layout, which of course encouraged a lot of green space, a lot of trees, a lot of gardens. So people started to feel like they were more in the countryside than they were in the city. And so to call this a modernist green city, I would agree. A very strict grid system, irrigation channels running everywhere, trees, parks, a sense of scale which is very human. That was my first impression.
Wow, interesting. What would you say about architecture that's just was very struck you most at the first glance? What did you notice?
Well, again, I think
architecture identity.
Yeah, in terms of the scale of the city, it's quite easy to, it's quite difficult to orientate yourself because you're on this grid system, and at times it's difficult to place yourself within the city. But everywhere you look, there are very well considered Soviet buildings, maybe 5-6 story buildings, apartments, blocks, interesting, intricate detailing to many of them. Again, as we discussed previously, it doesn't get you the feeling of being in, say, Warsaw or Budapest or Bucharest, where the monumentality of the building seems greater and the sense of scale is more overwhelming, and there seems to be more system building and prefabrication without the ornamentation. Whereas here, wherever you turn, it feels like you are presented with ornamentation, decoration, and interesting fabric elements. Lots of vernacular materials like pink limestone, for example, is used as opposed to, say, a simple prefabricated concrete panel. That pink limestone has the little shells that you can see, the detailing. I mean, it's I've not seen anything like it before. It was a first-time experience for me to engage with buildings like this.
And if you compare, so talking about the image of Almaty from the outside world, because you mentioned that you had already the view of the city before you arrived.
Yes.
So how would you describe your vision of Almaty before you arrived?
Before I read that chapter, even.
Yeah, before, and what changed after you came to the city?
Well, it was a real unknown for me, because it is quite far from home. I've not been to Central Asia before, and certainly the reaction you get from your friends and your colleagues when you tell them where you're going is, what? You're going where? They kind of in some ways prejudice your view because they they say, why are you going there? What for? There is no understanding. There's no identity to this place in where I'm from. And my own reading of this city was that it had very interesting architecture. It was much more developed than, say, Bishkek, which is the first place I arrived, to Kyrgyzstan. It was a wealthier place. It was a more developed place, but it still had these incredible mountains, this huge mountain range. So I was very excited, I suppose, about coming, but it was a real sense of the unknown. I've travelled to a lot of places where I feel like I've had a much better understanding of what I'm going to find when I get there.
What was your source of knowledge when you were getting ready to come to Almaty? What did you refer to? What did you...
Well, my coffee table books, CCCP, and some of Owen's writings. He's also written in Landscapes of Communism about Central Asia. Design magazines. As I said, the popularization of Central Asia has reached a point to where you can start to form an understanding and an awareness of what the buildings, what the architecture looks like. It doesn't give you any identification about culture, people, ways of life, but you certainly get an understanding of of the buildings themselves. Yeah, but that has been achieved purely through this recent popularization of the design. Yeah.
And when you're mentioning coffee table books, how popular actually are they in the European region?
I would say that the CCCP book and the Russian constructivist coffee table books, the Soviet bus stops postcard book, I would say that you would find those at the top of the pile, so to say, of most designer bookshops in European cities. They've really reached out to a much wider audience. So I think to begin with, I received that book for Christmas, maybe in 2006, 2007, something like that. And I think to begin with, those kind of books were being given as gifts to people interested in architecture. So architects, designers, conservationists, that kind of audience. But in the last 10 years or so, those books are now being given out to people as gifts to a wider people who have no professional engagement.
Really? That's interesting.
Yeah,
fact.
That's what I'm trying to say. That's my message, is that this isn't something which is now, contained within a niche group of designers and people interested in these elements, but it's, most people would recognise that those books now, and certainly some of the most iconic buildings from that. If you go to Google Images and type in, Soviet buildings, they'll come up. Those buildings will come up first thing on Google.
Interesting.
Millions and millions of searches on the internet.
But can you find a lot about Almaty though in this kind of books?
No, I wouldn't. No, I wouldn't. This is what I want to say in my presentation. Is that the evidential values and historic values of these buildings are absent.
Oh.
Because people will look at the buildings, they won't know where they actually are. They won't know which cities they relate to and which people populated them.
Okay.
They just know they belong to this Central Asian typology, but they don't know beyond that.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
That's interesting.
It's very much just a postcard from the East and a postcard from Central Asia, but it's not a postcard from a specific city or from a specific group of people.
The reason I'm asking you about this is because we had quite a lot of conversation recently among citizens and professionals about city branding in general. And so would you say that this kind of architecture identity could be one of the, markers to use for city branding? That's one of the triggers to make people come here.
Yeah, absolutely. My understanding is, I haven't been to Astana, But again, reading some of Owen's writings and some of the writing you might get in our newspapers, The Guardian, for example, it's quite clear they're two very different cities, and that Astana has a lot more contemporary architecture and a lot less retention of its Soviet heritage. That's my understanding. That's not that is not a comprehension that we have in the UK or in Europe. I think there'll be no distinction between Almaty and Astana, for example. So in terms of the city branding, you've got two very different cities, vastly different styles of architecture and identity, but we would be unaware of that, and it's only since I've got here that I now understand that. So I will go home now with a good understanding of Kazakhstan and the difference between the two cities, but before I came here they were one and the same to me.
Interesting. So
so city. Sorry, just one last thing on that.
Sure.
There's a huge opportunity here in terms of city branding for this city to create its own identity, because it has its own identity, but I don't think that's recognised.
Okay, you mean here?
Here, this
by
city.
locals.
Yeah.
And the power of its outer image that's already there.
Yes.
Right? Okay. Interesting. Linking you're saying that these coffee table books are actually now available to a bigger audience, and that we have this unique typology in the area. That would be definitely an asset.
Yeah.
But coming back to aesthetical value of architecture in the value criteria, maybe we can start from just listing what are the criteria values out there, like as we talk about value of architecture in general.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So can you just list those really briefly?
So the values. Yeah. So that's something I'll be talking about this evening. That we define our heritage assets, and I say heritage assets because they go beyond simply buildings. They can be landscape settings, they can be parks and gardens, they can be monuments. But let's try to set the parameters at buildings for the purposes of this discussion. You have the four values: evidential values, historic values, communal values, and aesthetic values. So that's how we seek to define the values, the overall values of a heritage asset. So did you want to discuss each one of those?
Yeah. For example, I would like to know more about aesthetical value, as you mentioned it, as one of the biggest assets of the coffee table books.
Yes.
Because you were saying that from these books you don't get the evidential value or historical value of what's happening in the region. But if you specify the aesthetical value, what does it mean and how is it measured in general?
So I think it goes back to what you said about what is heritage and what are the benefits of heritage. I think it goes back to that original discussion, and I think that it's about a sense of well-being. So the other values, which perhaps we can discuss at some point, those other values, the historic, evidential and communal, I think there can be some quite strongly negative connotations with those values. With aesthetic values, I think if there is a broad consensus that people agree upon a building or a heritage asset is beautiful, it is aesthetically pleasing, then it contributes very strongly to a sense of well-being. If it is lost, if those aesthetic values are lost, then that sense of well-being could be diminished.
Oh, wow, interesting. Are there any international indicators which can be linked to this aesthetical value? Are there any, not measurements, but maybe scaling or whatever, or researchers linking dependence of well-being from aesthetic.
Yes, I mean there are a number of international charters, the Venice Charter, I think, of the 1960s, and the Borough Charter, of the 1980s, and these sought to identify historic values and the integral values of heritage that make them an irreplaceable asset. So, that they have been defined through an agreement, an international agreement, that they are, they can't be replaced, and once they are gone, they're gone forever, and accordingly, the sense of well-being that brings, the values that they bring, the benefits that they bring to a society, cannot be replaced. It's not something which we can mitigate through, new design or, reinvestment. They have their own values which are simply unique and irreplaceable. I think that's the international framework.
Yeah. Which also reminds me of this index of happiness.
Yes.
Which is international. I mean, there is a scale of index of happiness in different cities, and it's like complex, and it consists of different parameters.
Yeah.
But would you say that it can be, how to say, this? Say that's. It's complicated. This heritage, do you think it can be put somewhere in this scaling, somewhere in between, or
in this kind of index of happiness?
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
how would you put it
this
there?
this isn't an area that I would consider myself to be an expert in terms of how we define happiness and well-being and everything else.
But it's a complicated index.
It is, but I think that. When aesthetic values, the criteria for those, when we talk about each of those values, they are subjective, and they are that there are going to be opinions which divide. So, there's going to be criticisms of saying, well, buildings with a high aesthetic value contribute indisputably to an improved sense of well-being, if a building is divisive in in the way in which people interpret it. So I think that if it is something which is led through the community, and you can reach a very high consensus of agreement that a building has strong aesthetic values, then I don't think it's possible to dispute the fact that it will increase your sense of well-being.
Okay.
Which is my point about the Western ideas of these buildings. It's becoming hugely popular. Those aesthetic values we have given those buildings, they're not, the local consensus is may be different. But from the West, it seems like there's a growing consensus that these buildings have very strong aesthetic values. And so when we come here, for example, me, I'm really appreciating these buildings, and they are contributing to my sense of well-being.
As a tourist, as a visitor.
Yeah, absolutely.
As a new person to the city.
And if I came here and they'd all been demolished and replaced by, mirrored,
so which should be responsible before all this audience who is already knowledgeable. About Almaty and its architecture.
If I come back and every single one of these very well considered Soviet modernist buildings has been externally insulated with bright green cladding. I'm not going to deny it. My sense of well-being will be incredibly diminished.
Which brings me to the next question in terms of not the sense of belonging and the sense of kind of not ownership, but belonging, the sense of belonging to the city on the one hand, and this kind of communal value of the building, because even though it's in the private ownership, that doesn't mean that it's an asset only of one person who owns the building, right? So there's definitely should be another asset to it, since it's like located in the city and it has some certain alter value to the people who might not own it commercially, but kind of have an impact from it as well. So what would you say about communal value of the buildings? How do you measure them, and what do they mean?
Well, are we talking about Almaty?
Yeah, we talk about Almaty. Maybe you can talk about your definition of communal value and then link it to some of the examples here. Yeah,
sure. Well, I think firstly is to make that again, that the distinction between the way in which we have identified aesthetic values in Almaty, but we don't have any communal values to these buildings because they are not familiar to us and we do not belong to that community. But in terms of, as a reference in the UK, you talked about them being private buildings. Well, most buildings in the UK now are private. We have very few state-owned buildings left. Most buildings belong to, are in the hands of private ownership, and yet that doesn't mean that they don't have communal values, of course. Similarly, in this country, everything was state-owned until 1991, and then since then, obviously, there's been a gradual decline of state ownership in the buildings, but that I don't think that has any kind of relationship to the communal values. It shouldn't do. It doesn't matter who owns those buildings. What matters is who populates them. What matters is who is exposed to that building on a daily basis. Who has to walk past it? Who has to engage with it? Maybe they work there. Maybe they live there. Maybe they spend their recreational time in that area. That's how you identify those communal values. Do they have a personal story with that building? Were they born there? Did their family live there? Did they go and visit their secret lover there? There's all of these things. It has no relationship and no bearing on who owns those buildings. And I think that's what identifies the communal values. Is it's about personal connections to that building. And for a visitor, obviously, I don't have any. I mean, they're starting to grow. I'm staying in Hotel Kazakhstan, and I'm absolutely loving it. So, my communal values are growing, but they are obviously a tiny amount.
But how are they measured? For example, in UK, can you bring some bright examples?
So in the UK, a building which is about. Generally, it's about the people's experience in their lifetime. So. If you take, for example, a Victorian workhouse, which I've been dealing with at the moment in my area in the East Midlands, it's going to be, there's an application in to demolish that building, and as a workhouse, it was built in the 1830s, and it has a very dark story. But it's an interesting story. But there's the people who live in that area, they don't really have any strong communal value to it as a workhouse. However, it was converted into a hospital, and so the building as a hospital has a much stronger association to the people who live there because they were all born there. And when they were ill or their family were ill, they went there. So they have a much stronger communal value to that building as a hospital than they do with its historic origins as a workhouse, because they weren't around at the time in which it was a workhouse. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Yeah, that helps to understand how a building can have a story with different episodes, different chapters, and those communal values can be different depending on how people relate to it.
Okay. So in this case, talking about communal value in UK, so how people use this asset to protect and preserve buildings.
It's probably, I would argue, my experience, and this is only my experience now, so I wouldn't want to go on record and say this is the this is the current climate. But my own experience is that trying to get a building listed on the basis of its communal value is probably the weakest of the four.
Oh, okay.
Because
in UK, you mean?
yes, I've even had professional so-called heritage consultants who've been employed by the owner of a building that doesn't want the building to be listed, because I want to get it listed as the local authority. The owner doesn't, because they want to demolish it, for example. So they will employ experts, so-called experts, to object to my application.
Yeah.
And I can remember very clearly one of these experts, they said, just because the building is familiar to people does not give it communal values, like as in, communal historic values. And I thought, wow, can you imagine someone is actually trying to deny a building its communal values just because people know about it. So, but there is a point there, which is Historic England might look at that and say, well, okay, everybody knows this building, but is that enough to get it listed? Is that enough to protect this building?
Yeah.
If it doesn't have any aesthetic values, if it doesn't have historic or evidential values, I'm afraid, that's probably going to be a no. It would need to have outstanding communal values, like a really, really strong engagement with the local community to that building for it to be listed just on that basis alone.
Okay.
There would need to be associated as evidential or historic values or aesthetic values to go with. Yeah, they'd have to work together. You can get a building listed on the basis of its evidential values without any other.
Yeah.
So we talked about, for example, the Britain's first reinforced concrete bridge, footbridge. I mean, there's no communal values there. It's in the middle of nowhere on a canal, 30 miles away from any urban environment. But it's Grade 2 star listed. Because it has its own strong evidential values. So, you were able to take one value there and get that building listed. I don't think you can do that with communal values.
Yeah, wow. So, when you're mentioning that it's one of the weakest value
in my
criteria,
experience.
But also, if you link it to the historical value.
Yeah.
So.
They are closely connected.
Yeah, but also talking about historical value, it is. Historical value might also be a bit subjective. You know
Yes,
what I mean? Because
very much so.
who is writing history?
Absolutely,
and who is putting this object as important in history? How do you define historical value in your practice?
Okay, so historiography is an issue with the historical values, because you start to get different definitions of a building's history, different definitions of a heritage asset's history. If you look at buildings in the UK which are listed for their historic values, and we're talking about some of the Grade 1 and the Grade 2 star listed buildings, that's because they've got something really seriously important about them in terms of a person that lived there, something that building contributed to a major event in history. Maybe the Civil War, the English Civil War was started in that building, or a king was found hiding there who was then executed, or the First World War, maybe it was a famous prisoner was kept there, or it's about
so it can be speculative.
And those are very they're really big episodes. If you're going to try and get a building listed now on the basis of its historical values, they need to be fresh ideas. I think they need to be new. So the Black history is something which is now being considered in the UK. LGBT history is now being considered. There are a lot of places where the repression of homosexuality took place. Toilets, for example, where gay men had to meet in order to fraternise. Those they became a monumental part of their history. They're now being listed. The toilet itself has no aesthetic values. It's a toilet. It's just a toilet.
That's interesting.
And it has no evidential value because it doesn't tell us about a toilet typology. But it does have very prescient historic value, because it's the place where perhaps it became the first known toilet in London where these men could meet, you know, under intense scrutiny and surveillance and oppression. So, you know, these are new histories which are now being written because previously no one has dared to write them.
But listing this not typical objects
Yeah.
like as heritage means that somebody stands behind it, right? So it's a matter of people who want
Yes,
to
absolutely.
push
Oh, yeah.
their historical values forward as well,
Yeah.
and linking it to the artifacts that are present there in the city,
Yes.
right? Which leads me to the next question. Who can put objects on the list in UK?
Yeah.
And is that easy to do? for
Okay.
people?
Yeah. So as we've discussed, you and I previously, anybody can do this.
Yeah.
We could sit here right now, open our laptops, identify a building in the UK, and submit an application. It doesn't matter who we are or where we come from. Historic England need to take that impartially and on the basis of the submitted information.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter who you are. There's no politics behind the applicant themselves. It's just it's the content of the report. So, for example, if we go back to the LGBT community, they will set up perhaps a thematic survey of their own important buildings from a in terms of the historic values. And those thematic studies will be done in conjunction with Historic England, the government. So, the LGBT community will reach out to Historic England, or maybe Historic England will reach out to them. I don't know. I'm not part of those programs. But whatever happens, they'll work in partnership together, and the LGBT community will obviously go and speak to the people who were involved in these stories, the people who had to go to these toilets, who had to hide behind, places so they wouldn't be caught, trying to live their own lives, so once that's done, those reports will be submitted, and then Historic England must consider them. So that means you get a whole range of organisations, of individuals, of civic groups who submit applications. Another one is the 20th Century Society, which I'm a member of, and I'm quite active with in the UK. They are a charity. They survive purely on charitable donations. They are London-based, and they are, they're quite well design-led. So they have a fantastic magazine which features in many of these, high-end designer bookshops and magazine shops and things. They publish quarterly. They curate wonderful stories and building typologies of the 20th century. They promote the awareness of 20th century buildings, and they have 2 full-time caseworkers, salaried caseworkers. They don't get paid very much money. Nowhere near enough to live in London, I think. I once applied for a job and I was amazed at how little, how they can survive. And I often think, there must be some other
Somebody
income
has to
there.
preserve them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. But it's clearly like a passion, and those 2 caseworkers will submit buildings for listing every month. So Historic England will have a branch of their organisation that is for 20th century buildings, and they'll be working with those caseworkers from the 20th century charity, and every month they will be considering applications. And a few will get listed, and most, I think, they will refuse most. There's in the magazine at the end of every month, the end of every quarter, they have a summary of all the buildings they've submitted, and then the outcome. And you can see which ones have been successful.
Okay, so previously you were mentioning that people actually anybody can apply to preserve some historical building.
Yeah.
But how active actually are people wanting to apply to preserve certain buildings? How active are they in your opinion, in your practice?
Okay.
How many applications do you receive?
So I think that where this really comes from are the civic societies.
Yep.
So it's community led,
Yep.
and they are voluntary organisations. Pretty much every city in Britain has a civic society. The smaller towns now are starting to fall away.
Yeah.
So the civic societies are starting to, because the next generation aren't being as engaged as the previous generation. But every big city will have a very active civic society. As I said, it's purely voluntary.
Yeah.
It's done after work, after hours, or by retired people. You have architects in there, you have engineers, you have planners, you have professionals who have worked in that industry, and they want to give their time and their expertise, and they will get together once a week, most of them, and they will consider what's being done to buildings at that time. So planning applications, they'll review them and they'll comment on them, and they'll say, we support this or we don't support this. And then also they will identify buildings for listing, and they will submit them for listing.
Okay, but do you, because we have quite a different context here in the city locally, and we don't have that many active organizations that are involved in preservation of heritage, would you say there's we have some perspective here, and what do we need to do to start this process and to become more active?
Well,
I mean, maybe it's a bad question, but anyways, in your personal opinion.
Well, so what do you need to do?
Yeah.
I mean, the difficulty is, as in the UK, there's no money for this necessarily. There's very little in the way of funding. Most of this conservation campaigns are voluntary led, and so you need to, I don't know, you perhaps have to help me with this, is there a passion within the community to do this on a voluntary basis? Is there a passion to do this after hours? Is there a retired community? Because, for example, a lot of our civic societies, their chairman, their treasurers, their secretaries are all retirees. So do you have a retired generation who live through these buildings in a way that they want to save what they remember from their youth, for example? Do you have that, or is it a younger generation? Do you need to mobilise them? Because in the UK, I think we're quite comfortable in our cities that we have these retirees, and they are experts. They really are. I mean, it's almost like they have a competition who can get the most buildings listed.
Wow, really?
And there's a guy in we almost call them like the stripes on the on the shirt.
Yeah.
Like military stripes. We've got a guy, he's called Ian Wells in Nottingham, where I live, and I think he's the secretary or the chairman of the Nottingham Civic Society. And when he kind of comes in the room, he has this aura about him, which is like, wow, I think he's got 5 buildings listed. Now that is pretty amazing. Cool. Yeah, it's like it's like you almost see the 5 stars on his sleeve. Or he may not have got all 5 listed, but he might have got some of them upgraded from a grade 2 to a grade 2 star, or from a grade 2 star to a grade 1. He's done that through his own dedicated energy. He's not received a penny for it. So and I always look at him. I've only got 1 building listed myself in my job, and in my spare time I've only managed to get 1. I've had several refused. I've had several given. They've given it real thought. But I've only actually got one star on my sleeve, and there he is, and he's got lots. So, if you're referring that back to Almaty, is there the energy? Is there the drive? Is there the ambition? What I want to do today in my talk this evening is I want to try and create that, like that swelling. That groundswell of interest and enthusiasm.
But I need to say that being a citizen of Almaty for most of my lifetime, I would like to say that we have what we deserve. That's my very strong opinion.
We have what we deserve. Okay.
I mean, like the city landscape, it's changing not I mean, if something in the city is changing that we're not happy with, then something needs to be done. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not that we're just saying, well, okay, you know, the modernity is like approaching and we have like the economy is changing, so we should just passively watch what's happening in the city landscape, you know, because obviously commercial industry is developing much faster than sometimes civic society or whatever. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah.
So in these terms, the landscape that we're observing right now is just not what we deserve. It's actually what we deserve. Like because we were not active enough to try to invest our time and energy.
Okay.
And that's why.
But then I can maybe turn the question on to you here and say, do you think that because of the lack of transparency and democracy in the decision-making process, there isn't the, you know, it has impacted and maybe diminished that level of engagement and interest from the community? Because, you know, in the UK, the civic voice is powerful, and so you know, these people, in some ways, you know, you might even argue and say, well, they do it because they love the power. You know, like you
could be.
You know, civic societies love to have their voices heard. So you might say that, you know, some people have retired and they no longer feel like they're listened to. Well, if they join an organisation like this and they make enough noise, they will be, you know, they'll be recognised. Whereas here, if it's just dismissed, if what you say as a community is disregarded and not considered, then why should there be an engagement? So could you argue that, you know, you've got what you deserve, or could you say that it's more of an injustice?
I would say both. Because in terms of moving things forward, in terms of what our project is trying to do with all this heritage thing, is we are trying to give people tools and provide more transparency of the process. And this is our role in preservation. We might not necessarily go and list any of the objects, but we will certainly try to do so to show the process. We don't have the resources to protect every single building that we subjectively think is important to us. Because who are we to decide and to say that this is important and this is not?
I know, but
we are giving the tools to people, so if they have passion and energy, they know what to do. So, and then we will see. So it's kind of experimental. I don't know what will happen this year or next year. We are inputting a lot of effort, but we don't know what will happen next. And it's an open question, actually. If we provided the tools, provided the knowledge, and provided the, you know, there's only one thing which is like not obvious, like this energy and motivation. Like, do people really need it? And this will be the question, the answer actually.
All I can say though is, if you experience the feeling of getting a building listed, it is empowering. And it is a huge incentive to carry on, because once you feel like you have, you know, your efforts can be seen, and you know you've secured the future of a heritage asset through your own efforts, that perpetuates and stimulates further participation.
Wow, that's really promising. Okay, thank you. I think this is all I have to ask. Just a second.